The question we want to look at tonight is, how does Christ-centered cultural transformation happen? And each of you here plays a key role. Every single one, whether you're in business or in ministry, both play a key role. Now, I've found that changing the world is hard. Has anyone else discovered that? Sometimes it makes you wonder if it's even possible, right? Is it really possible to change the world? Well, what we are going to look at, so the subtitle of my book is How the Gospel Transforms the Way You Get Things Done. We're going to look at how the way you get things done transforms the world. And that comes from knowing how the gospel transforms the way you get things done. So all of us have to get things done. And I'm saying the gospel, since it applies to all of life, needs to affect the way we go about getting things done, being productive, doing email, doing our jobs. But we also need to know when the gospel changes the way you get things done, there's another effect as well. There's an effect on the culture. There's an effect on your workplace. There's an effect on your community. There's an effect on the culture. So if you let the gospel change the way you get things done, then the way you get things done can change the world. Now, how does that work? That's a radical statement. Am I saying all of us can be or should be Steve Jobs? And I am not. Now, I think more traditional view of cultural transformation used to be that change individuals and you change the world. But as James Davidson Hunter points out, that didn't seem to be working over the last 100 years. What went wrong? And he argues that what we were missing is the place of institutions in changing the world. Institutions are the power centers. And so if you really want to change the world, you have to change institutions, not just individuals. So that throws a loop into some of our efforts, but it also shows us how business relates, because businesses are institutions. And in fact, they're one of the primary institutions in society. And as we've all been discovering more and more through the faith and work movement, business is one of the chief arenas in which the gospel can spread, in which we love our neighbor, the gospel can spread, and we can change the world. It's not just those in ministry that are able to have an impact. Those in business play a key impact and a just as important impact, maybe more important impact. And we'll talk about the way those in ministry can help those in the business world later. But through business, that's one of the chief ways that we carry our faith into the world. So if we know how to change the way we do business, we can know how to change the world. And in fact, most Christians are in the business world. I think the stats are that it's something like 95% of Christians are not in ministry. So what do those Christians need to be doing differently in order for us to change the world? What do they need to be doing differently? And if they do it differently, I would argue we will change the world, because that's where 95% of Christians are. Now, what do I mean by changing the world? I mean something holistic here. I include business as missions in changing the world. So the advance of the gospel. So this conference has been about business as missions. I include that, the advance of the gospel in changing the world. And then also we need to be holistic. We need to think in terms of renewing the culture socially, economically, and spiritually. So it's the advance of the gospel, but also caring about all aspects of life, the physical and economic dimension, as well as the social dimension. Now, how do you change the world in your business? Or if you are in ministry and you teach others how to go about their work and advance the gospel and change the world, what do you teach them? And what I believe is there is something we are missing in our discussions of how business advances the gospel. We are missing something important and essential. And that's what we're going to highlight tonight. If we are going to actually advance the gospel through our work, we have to understand this. And it has to do with the way work relates to a central and fundamental Christian teaching. In fact, the most central and fundamental Christian teaching. And what is that teaching? and it's the teaching on love. What I'm going to argue is that Christ-centered love is God's plan for changing the world through business. Love. Love is God's plan for changing the world. Now, in one sense, that resonates because we know the power of love and the centrality of love in the Bible. God is love, and the central ethic of the Christian life and heart is love. And even if you give all your possessions to the poor or deliver your body to be burned but have not love, you've done nothing of value, Paul says. So love is absolutely essential. So if we are going to work as Christians, right, we need to understand how love relates to our work. Otherwise, our work isn't having any value. We might earn all the profit in the world, but if we have not love, we have earned nothing, ultimately. So we need to understand this, but almost no one talks about this. And the reason is probably pretty simple. We have a very sentimental view of love almost. Have you ever walked into a bakery or something and they say, these cookies were baked with love? Like, immediately I want to run. I don't want those cookies. I'm like, okay, they are probably really bad cookies, baked with love, not skill, right? We see this trade-off between love and skill. Love like makes up for lack of skill. So if the baker is really bad, just put up a sign that says baked with love, and that'll make up for the fact that the cupcakes are terrible. So we're kind of skeptical about love, and we also think of love as something more sentimental, or maybe it applies at church. How can you bring love into the workplace? In fact, that can seem incomprehensible even. We don't think about love when we go to work. We think of production, doing what the boss wants, doing what the manager wants, getting things done, making a living. We're not thinking about love. But we need to be, because as we saw, love is central to the Christian ethic. And love is the greatest commandment. What are we supposed to do at our jobs? Do we set aside the great commandment from 8 to 5? Love God with your whole being and love your neighbor as yourself. Is that in a separate compartment? It starts at 5 o'clock when we leave our jobs, but doesn't apply before that? Of course not. The scriptural commands apply to all of life. Christianity, as so many have been pointing out, is a whole worldview. It's a whole way of looking at the world of all of life, not just some of life. So we have to understand how to bring love into work, and that's the key to understanding how our faith relates to our work. So that's a very important point. If you want to understand how your faith and work relate, you need to know how love and work relate. And that's hard to do. That's hard to do. That's what we're going to look at. But first, we need to know that love really does change the world. I think we can tell from the centrality of love in the biblical ethic that we do need to bring love into our work. But does it really have the transforming effect that I'm talking about? And it does. Let's look at 2 texts, some really neat ones. First, by the way, I got thinking about this because I was contemplating James Hunter's view and Tim Keller and others that you have to change institutions to change the world, right? But what about 1 Corinthians 1? God has chosen what is weak to shame the wise, right? So he uses those who are out of power. So I'm like, well, how's that fit? And the only thing I thought of that those out of power can do that has great power is love. I mean, there's a lot of things, obviously, but we need to have a way of changing the world that applies to those out of power as well as those in power. And anyway, that's how I got on this. Okay, so now let's look at how we know scripturally love changes the world. John 13:34 through 35, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." So we are to love one another as Christ loved us. And then he says this, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So there we see the beginnings of a transforming effect. What's the transforming effect of love here? People know we're Christians. People know we follow Christ. How are they going to know? Is it if we get in charge of the key cultural institutions and say I'm a Christian? Is that how people will know we are Christians? And no, of course not, because they might say, well, look at your life. You say you're a Christian. I don't want anything to do with that. The only way people ultimately will know we are Christians is by our love. no matter how much power we have or how successful our businesses are, they won't know that we are Christians unless we have love for one another. Now, right here, Jesus isn't saying love transforms the culture. I don't think he's quite going that far here, but he's getting close, because if people know you are Christians, that's a big change, right? And then that's going to have some repercussions. Like 1 Peter 3:15, maybe some people are going to ask you about the hope that is in you. Have you ever wondered, how do you get people to ask? It's interesting in 1 Peter 3, that relates to evangelism in the workplace, and and Peter talks about always being ready with an answer to those who ask you about the hope that is in you. But why are people asking? They're seeing something different about you. They're seeing hope in you. But how do they see that hope? Maybe in part through your love. Your love. So it gets the ball rolling. Now, here's the key text on how love causes cultural transformation. Now, that's a radical claim. I am saying love causes cultural transformation. I don't hear many people saying that. I hear lots of people talking about cultural transformation, renewing the culture socially, economically, and spiritually, and I love that. I'm all about that. That influenced my book so big. And I see people talking about tactics, strategies, and lots of great stuff about that. But I don't see people talking much about the core dynamic, which is love, and it's right in the text. This is fascinating. Ephesians 5. Paul has some strange language here. Sometimes I don't totally get it. Listen to this. Well, let me just walk you through it. First, chapter 5, verse 1, Paul says, "Be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us." So there's, again, love, and it's here given as a central New Testament command. Walk in love as Christ loved us. So we're commanded to walk in love, and when we do that, we're following the example of Christ. Now, Paul starts talking about decision-making and productivity in this passage. In fact, this is the core New Testament passage on time management and productivity, because in verse 15, we're told to look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time. There's productivity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So knowing the Lord's will has something to do with making the best use of the time and being productive. And we know his will from verse 1 is love each other. Now, here's something fascinating. Paul repeats that back up in verse 10. He says, try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. So he's still talking about productivity and decision-making there. And listen to how he talks. Right before that, he says, do not become partakers with those who walk in darkness. At one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. So believers are light, right? And that makes you think of Matthew 5:16, right? Let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Let your light shine. Paul's saying you are light. And he echoes that in Philippians 2. He says, walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. So he's connecting walking as children of light with pleasing God in our daily actions. And then he says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So this is the part that's confusing. What does Paul mean when he says, when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible? For anything that becomes visible is light. What's that mean? If you expose the deeds of darkness, some things will become visible. That is, they will become light. What is going on there? Peter O'Brien nails this in his commentary on Ephesians. First, by expose, Paul isn't meaning go out there rebuking unbelievers all day long. He's talking about illuminate. He's illuminate, and you do that by simply walking as light, chiefly. And then what Paul is saying is when that happens, the things that are exposed or illuminated by the light become light. That's verse 14. What he means is some of those who are walking in darkness, as you live as light in the Lord, which means walking in love, some of those who walk in darkness will become light, like you. In other words, as you live in a Christ-honoring way among unbelievers, live from love, The light of the gospel shines through your words and deeds and causes some people to become Christians. In other words, love has a transforming effect. O'Brien points out this passage is describing the process by which those who are in darkness turn to the light. It's the process by which it happens. And Paul's saying our behavior is essential. Not just preaching, also actions. They are essential. They are part of the process by which God transforms lost people into Christians. And confirmation of this is at the end of verse 14 where Paul quotes probably an early Christian hymn. Therefore it says, "Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Paul's talking about conversion there. Awake, rise from the dead. He's talking about conversion. So a lot is at stake here in the way we live. Not just in the way we live in the sense of make sure you don't sin, but make sure you proactively do good for others. Make sure you love, because love is central to what Paul is talking about here. Central to the behavior that causes non-believers to become Christians. So love has a transforming effect. But how does this work at work? How can that be? All we've seen so far is that it has a transforming effect. Now, how do we do this? And the answer is, and how can that even be? We need a right and more accurate view of love. See, very often we have a limited and non-holistic view of love. We think it only applies in certain segments of life, and we think it primarily has to do with spiritual needs. But when we open up to the wider biblical view, then we can see how love actually changes the world. So the first question we need to ask there is, where does love happen biblically? Where does it happen? Well, I've alluded to the fact that it happens in the business world, but how do we know that biblically? That's what we're going to look at right here, and it's right here in this text, because after telling us to walk as children of the light, and that the result of that is that some unbelievers will come to faith, Paul then says, he tells us about productivity and time management, because that's when verse 15 comes, and he says, look carefully then. So he's connecting it to what came before. He says, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. So he's saying, therefore, because you know love has a transforming effect, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. Now, this is interesting. So he's telling us to walk as wise people and make the best use of the time. So there's productivity in the world of work. And one way we know this is when Paul says to walk as wise people, he's actually connecting back to Proverbs 6. This is cool because a lot of times we over-spiritualize that and we think walking as wise people just means evangelizing. But Paul is also saying walking as a wise person means knowing how to get things done. Because here in Proverbs 6, check this out. Verse 6, Paul says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest." So it's talking about productivity there and saying knowing how to get things done is a component of wisdom. That's a component of wisdom. So Paul has a holistic conception of wisdom here. And then he goes on and he says, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. That's connecting back to love, because the will of the Lord is that we love each other. So the way to make the best use of the time is to love people, and that walking in wisdom includes knowing how to get things done. Here's another way we see this. In Ephesians 6, this is very interesting. Paul's talking to slaves, and by implication, all workers. And he says, render your service with a good will, there's love, as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. So Paul is referring to the things we do in our jobs as good things. Does that call anything to mind? It calls to mind Ephesians 2:10. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So we're created in Christ for good works. Good works are a big deal. Where do we do these good works? It's so easy to think it's just talking about mission trips to Africa. But what we see in Paul's conception is the good works that we do include the things we do in our jobs. It includes doing emails, going to meetings, creating marketing plans. All those things are good works because in chapter 6, verse 8, he refers to them as good things. He refers to the activities of our daily work as good things, that is, good works. So in Paul's conception, doing good includes our jobs. Now that is utterly transforming because it means you don't have to wait until the church potluck to be doing good works. You don't have to wait till that summer missions trip to be doing good work. You don't have to go to a soup kitchen to do good work. As important as all that is, you can be doing good works all day long simply by doing your job. And that infuses your daily work with incredible significance. You are able to see your work as a service to others. And Luther pointed this out. Our jobs are one of the chief arenas in which we love our neighbor because our jobs meet the needs of others. So love in the biblical conception is happening in the workplace. If good works are happening in the workplace, that means love is happening in the workplace, right? So you can't have good works without love. So the biblical view is that love does indeed happen at work. It's central to the biblical ethic of productivity. You're not productive if you're not walking from love, because if you're not walking from love, you're not walking according to the will of the Lord. And Paul says the will of the Lord is what defines productivity. So love applies at work and getting things done. It also applies in our families, obviously. That's not the focus of this message, but we don't want to forget about that. We don't want to focus so much on work and say, love people at work, and then we forget, love people at home too. So remember that. But love applies at work. The third thing we need to know about love is that it's holistic. Just as it applies to every area of life, it also applies to the full range of human needs. We often think of love as just focusing on the spiritual needs, but love addresses the full range of needs. Look at the command. Love your neighbor as yourself. How do we love ourselves? Like, if I'm thirsty, do I say, got to read the Bible first? Hang on. Before I go get a drink, got to read my chapter from the Gospel of John. No, I just go get a drink. We attend to the full range of our own needs. And if we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, that means we are to attend to the full range of other people's needs. So love is holistic. That's another way we can understand how doing our jobs is a matter of loving people. Even if you are making widgets all day, or let's say you're at Chick-fil-A making chicken sandwiches all day. How's that love? You're meeting physical needs. Because love includes the meeting of physical needs, not just the meeting of spiritual needs. If you get to the end of the day and you haven't evangelized any coworkers, have you loved people? Yes. Because you've made chicken sandwiches all day. You've helped meet people's needs. But now is where we need to ask the question, how do you love? Okay, so we have to love. Love applies at work. Love is God's plan for cultural transformation. But how do we do it? And this is essential to know, otherwise we'll botch it. We won't actually be loving people. We'll be the guy that's ticking everyone off because maybe we are trying to evangelize all day and we're doing terrible work, creating a bad testimony. Or maybe we just don't know how to apply love at work, and so we're not applying it because we don't know how. The first thing you need to know about loving people anywhere, including at work, is love means acting from a real goodwill towards the other person. You want their welfare. That's at the heart of what it means to love someone. You want their welfare to the point where you take action in order to serve it. You need to make that motive explicit. So here's the thing. So we've seen, if you're at Chick-fil-A making chicken sandwiches all day, you're loving people because you're meeting their need for food. But what I'm saying is go a step further and do it on purpose. Don't just realize your work is a service to others, but do it as a service to others. Do you see the difference there? One is saying it is the case that your work is serving people, which is true. The other is saying, now make that motive explicit. Don't just make the chicken sandwiches or argue the legal cases in order to make a living. Do it in order to serve people. Do it because you really want to benefit the other person. Now that's That's very radical, because a lot of people go to their jobs, they just do it maybe because they enjoy it or they got to earn a living. I'm saying as a Christian, one of the chief ways your faith transforms your work is it brings in the explicit motive of love, doing your work as a service to others. So that's the first thing you need to know. Second, be on the lookout to meet needs. Love is proactive. Love doesn't simply wait until asked. It anticipates needs. So think again of the command, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how do you love yourself? Do you wait until you're destitute to take action? Do you wait until your car runs out of gas to fill the tank? No, you keep an eye on the gauge. When it's getting low, you realize, hey, I got to stop at the gas station. Got to fill up. You anticipate your need. You plan. You act in advance. We are to do the same with others. Be on the lookout to meet needs. And in business, that's pretty cool, because that's kind of the job of business. Identify needs and meet them, and do it in a profitable way. Do it in a profitable way. Now, this is absolutely crucial to business. This is where we can go wrong, like as theologians, in talking about the workplace and love. I could just simply say, love others, do your work with the explicit motive of benefiting others, and I'm not quite connecting love and faith to your work, because I'm leaving out profit and revenue, which is essential to business. So do your work to benefit others, but do it in a profitable way. And that's the difference between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. In the nonprofit sector, you're doing things that the market just is, for some reason, it will not reward at a profit, but they need to be done. In the business world, you have to keep an eye on the revenue line. And what we need to do a better job of saying is, that's a good thing. That's approved by God. It's loving. So you really have two things you got to overlap in your head. What benefits others, and what will do it in a profitable way. And that's what's so easy for me to overlook. I have often made the mistake of just saying, oh, what will serve people, that's important to do, but not brought over it the other grid of, and produces the revenue that's needed. So you got to keep the two in place. So often the church has neglected the place of profit and revenue, but the business world has neglected the place of love and the motive. I'm saying keep them together. And then third, obviously, no one would argue with this, do good work. That's simply part of being holistic. You need to do your work with excellence. You need to be the guy not just people go to if they have a life problem or want donuts for the meeting, but if they have a complicated challenge in relation to their work. You have skill, have competence. Someone earlier said competence is like the pioneering, I forget how to put it, pioneering work of the gospel. It lends credibility to your confession of faith. Competence does. So competence is important. You want to do good work. But again, don't just do good work. Do it from love. And then fourth, this is one of the most important things in the business world. Let what serves the customer be the tiebreaker in making decisions. Don't let what serves the company be the first priority. Make what serves the customer be the first priority. And I would argue that flows from acting from love. Because if, as a business, you're seeking to serve a customer, then you need to let their needs take precedence. Here's an example. With your website, if you're trying to figure out how to gain more subscribers to your newsletter, a lot of websites have pop-ups. They pop up, subscribe. And that can be effective, but it's really annoying. It's annoying to have these pop-ups come up. And customers hate them. They do have an effectiveness, but customers hate them. So you need to ask yourself, as the marketing director or business owner, is that a way I want to interact with my customers? It might be effective, but is it loving? Is it loving to tick off your website visitors? I would argue it is not. Might not be a sin to use pop-ups, but it's not a good idea. If you are thinking in terms of what serves the customer, I would argue that's not how you're going to seek to increase newsletter subscriptions. You're going to take a different approach, which will feel generous and good to the customer. And those tend to be the sites that are most admired and respected. So it does have very significant revenue implications. So, or Apple is a great example. I sat next to a guy once who worked at Motorola, and he was talking about Apple, and I said, well, why is Apple so much more effective than Motorola? He said, because Apple is absolutely zealous about customer centricity. They're just all about putting the customer first and making things usable and as easy to use as possible. So that's another great example versus a lot of companies where you get their products and you're like, what? How do I use this? I would argue those are failures of love. Sometimes there's revenue implications coming in and they just, that was the only quality level that's possible. But by and large, shoddy work that's not well thought through is a failure of love. It's not just shoddy work, it's a failure of love. And then fifth, in your work, especially if you're a knowledge worker, go beyond just doing your job and always be seeking to share your knowledge, network, and compassion. In other words, be generous. So go about your work, always trying to connect people with those who can help solve their problems, sharing your network, share your knowledge, learn stuff, know how to do your job, know about the industry, and share it with people. Tell them that benefits them. And share your compassion. In other words, be human at work. Don't think that being human is just for outside of work. Don't even think that just developing friendships is for outside of work. Bring humanity into the workplace. There's a great book on this called Love is the Killer App by Tim Sanders. And this is actually at the heart of the ethic of the new economy. He argues love is the killer app. A killer app is a new product that's a category killer. It's just miles ahead of everything else. Everybody wants it. It changes the game. He's arguing that in business, love is the killer app. Love is the point of differentiation. In other words, if you bring love into your work, you will stand out. You will be a better employee. More people will want your business. More people will want to do work with you. Most of the time, you will advance more in your career if you bring love to your work. And that's a nice side effect. I'm not saying bring love to your work so that things will go better for you. I'm saying do it as Jesus says. Do it because it's the right thing to do. Love others without thought of return. But realize it will generally have a good return. The companies that we see being most effective are the companies that put the customer first, that have a purpose beyond making money. Jim Collins argues this very well in Built to Last, which is his best book. Lots of people talk about Good to Great, which is awesome, but I think Built to Last is the best one because in there he's got a chapter called More Than Profits, and he argues in their comparisons, the companies that said, we're just here to make money, that's it, they actually did less well. They made less profit over the long run than the companies that said, profit is necessary, but it's not the point. It's like vitamins, you need it, but our point here is to make a contribution to society. Those are the companies that actually did the best in the long run. And it's not a Christian book, obviously, but I look at that and I say, that's a very Christian ethic. We have something to learn from Jim Collins there. I actually sent Jim Collins a copy of my book, and he sent me a thank you back. I thought that was cool. Jim Collins there has discovered something that actually has roots in the biblical worldview. We are to learn from things like that. Sometimes we look down on secular thinking. Oh, that's from a business book. We don't do things that way. We're Christians. Wrong. There's a lot to learn from business books and secular thinking because a lot of it is echoing truths that are biblical. It's discovering things from common grace, and there's deeper roots in the scriptures. And if we can make those connections, we can really serve people and we can point to the gospel. That's a great way to point to the gospel in the workplace. Show how the Bible provides the deepest foundations beneath good business principles, like what Jim Collins is talking about there. And that's what I tried to do in my letter to him. I don't know if it had an impact or not, but I pointed out to him how his research has lots of ties to what the Bible says, and I think that's a really neat thing. That's a way of showing respect for non-believers, which is a good way of making a good testimony to the gospel. So, bring humanity, compassion to work. And what we see is there's actually a business case for doing that. in Tim Sanders' book, Love is the Killer App, and some of Jim Collins' work. The last thing we need to know is we need to learn productivity skills, because today there is so much coming at us. You no longer just have to do your work, you have to define your work. You have to decide what your work was, what your work is. Back 100 years ago, most work was manual labor. It was generally self-evident. If you were a farmer, you had cows to milk and fields to plow and equipment to fix, and you could see your work. Today, most of the time, you can't see your work. You have to come to your work and decide first, what is my work? That's a productivity skill. And then you need to know how to manage it amidst all the inputs and interruptions that you're receiving. That's productivity. So you need to learn the skills of productivity. But what I'm saying here is the chief productivity skill is something most of us never think of as a productivity skill, and that's love. And what that means is do your work with the explicit purpose of serving the other person. As you do that, people will begin to notice, because that stands out. If you're the guy who's doing great work and you're meeting the needs of your coworkers in ways that are compassionate and respectful, you look different. That's a way of being salt and light. And as we saw in Ephesians 5, as we live, as we go about our daily lives from love, the light of the gospel shines through our words and deeds and has a transforming effect. This is why if all Christians, or we'll just say 1 million Christians, started doing their work in the business world in a gospel-driven way, that is from love, it would have a massive transforming effect on society, because love is the way God changes society. So going back to the start, if we want to change the world, we need to change institutions. If we want to change institutions, we need to know how to do our work from love. As we do this, then we can finally understand how business as missions works, not only overseas, but also here. For the longest time, I was always confused. How do you do business as missions? Is business just a platform? And this brings it together, because it shows that in the very act of doing business, if you do it from love, your actions can have a transforming effect for the gospel, along with the other dimensions of human need: physical, social, and mental. So now, what do you do when you go to your workplaces? Whether you're an owner or a manager or whatever you do, go do your work explicitly from love. Don't reject good secular thinking or business practices, but bring in this motive of love. And if you're in ministry, a pastor or a professor, and you're teaching people about how to integrate faith and work, teach them to bring love into the workplace. And as more and more Christians start doing their work from love, we will begin to see God transform the world. So, all right. Some time for questions. Questions. Other viewpoints. Yeah.
I'm just trying to process.
Mm-hmm.
Does love transform, or does God transform?
Yeah. Well, I'd say God transforms through love. It's the means.
So we would be the channel.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. Yep. And I would say love is the working of God. When someone acts in love, God is working through them, and that's part of the doctrine of vocation, like Gene Veith, or I guess it's Veth, I learned earlier today is how you say it. He talks about, we pray, give us this day our daily bread, and God answers it through the farmer and the grocer, and that's God working to provide bread for us. And so also love is the working of God, and it is God's means of transforming.
What happens when it doesn't work?
Yeah,
Situations where
I know.
you love,
I know. I know.
in other words,
Yeah.
it becomes repressive, or they can even
Yeah.
persecute.
Yeah. Sometimes it doesn't work. Yep, that's right. And we are to do it anyway. So 2 thoughts on that. Jesus says, love your enemies. When someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other. He's saying, persevere. When it's not working, keep going. And eventually, sometimes it will have the transforming effect. Now, don't be a nuisance, obviously, but he's saying keep going. But what about when it doesn't work? The Bible talks about that too. I think, like in Matthew 5:16, I think Jesus is talking about this, the transforming effect of love, when he says, let your light shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. I think the light, the shining of the light is love, and it's tied to good works. You see that. And the result is people glorify God. But how? I think two ways. First Peter echoes this, and Peter talks about, or maybe it's 1 Peter 3, them glorifying God on the day of visitation. And I think a lot of commentators point out Peter has two things in view there. Number one, he's thinking some will be converted. So that's one transformation that the light has. But two, Peter's probably also saying that on the day of judgment, any excuse they have for not believing the gospel will be removed. So sometimes it doesn't work, but we are to love anyway, because sometimes it will work on the other side of perseverance. But even when it doesn't work at all, we're to do it because we're commanded to. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the person, the employer, the employee that followed your model and effectively implemented it. I think as people looked at them would say, that looks like Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think
Yeah,
for those
that's
who
good.
receive the love,
Yeah.
it's transformational.
Yeah.
And for those who don't,
Yep.
don't understand it, they're like, they reject
Yep.
and do everything else they do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because Christ was rejected by some, by many, and so that's going to happen to us too. You know, it's interesting, a point that I cut out, this is really fascinating. At the end of the Gospel of John, the point I left out was love includes suffering sometimes, and this is really fascinating because at the end of the Gospel of John, if you look at this through new eyes, Jesus says to Peter, after he restores him, asks him 3 times if Peter loves him, then at the end, Jesus says to Peter, follow me. Well, what did Jesus just do? He was just crucified. So if after being crucified, Jesus says to Peter, follow me, what does Jesus have in view there? Well, it probably includes suffering. That's a radical thing. And then also, Jesus had just told Peter what kind of death he would die. So following Jesus explicitly there includes the path of suffering. And frankly, that's hard. I don't like suffering. Suffering's hard. And I think one thing I would want to add to my message, and I tried to nuance this throughout, is while suffering will happen to us as Christians, still be careful. Don't be unnecessarily reckless, because it can hurt. And so realize suffering is going to happen, but do be as reasonable as you can. Don't take unnecessary risks. And probably a few years ago, I would have been a little more on the other extreme, saying actually fear of risk is one of the biggest things that gets in the way of love. And I still think it is. But now I would say be a little more careful about risks. And that's also why I emphasize profit more, because it's easy to say, oh, well, the customers are going to love this, so we're just going to do it this way. But if you didn't market test it well before and do that due diligence, maybe they aren't going to love it. So stay attuned to people's needs. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, right, man. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is a great thing to bring up. It's very important. I remember when I think I was 5, a neighbor kid started punching me, and I didn't fight back because I was like, we're not supposed to hit people. And I got in trouble for that, not by my parents, but by my grandpa. And, he was probably right there. I was probably, as a little 5-year-old, misapplying, you know, the misapplying kindness and being nice. And so in the business world and the world of work everywhere generally, there are some distinctions we need to make. It's kind of like, Romans 13, I believe, says, the government has the power of the death penalty for those who murder. And someone could say, well, that's not loving for them to take someone's life, but they're authorized to do that in that vocation. So it can be done in love when done in justice and for the sake of justice. And so there are these distinctions that come in. I think we need to make a slight distinction between the personal and business worlds. Let's take that guy on the basketball team. It's good for him to want to be out there and to take action to be out there. If he's just like, I'm just going to let it be, let this other guy who's not as good be out there, he's not necessarily serving his team very well. On the other hand, saying, hey, if I let that guy play so much, I'm not serving my team well, that very often becomes a cloak for selfishness. I think there's no question about that. It's so easy to just, and I think the solution is, and you tied this all to the relation between ambition and love. The solution is you are ambitious for the team, you're ambitious for your company, you're ambitious for the mission, not necessarily ambitious for yourself. So that player should be saying what's best for the team, and it is best for the team for him or her to be out there, but it isn't best for him to be pushy about it. And I think that's probably where the line gets drawn, or to cross lines, or to manipulate or pout or anything like that. It's analogous to earlier today in one of the sessions, David's session, he talked about making an honest profit. And I think that's where the line is. Same with ambition, same with the basketball player. Yeah, get out there in the game, but do it in an honest way. The last thing there, one time, a couple years ago, a friend of mine was starting a company, and someone in the same space said, don't start that company, it's going to compete with me, it's going to reduce my business. Well, I said, no. Start that company, do the best you possibly can. The Christian ethic of love does not mean don't start that competing business. It means do start that competing business, do it the best you possibly can, and maybe it'll make everyone better. So yeah, great question. Yeah.
I think it's very intriguing what you said, that it used to be your work was defined.
Yep.
The field was so big to plow,
Yeah.
or so much to do.
Yep.
Now you have to define the work.
Yeah.
It seems overwhelming.
I know.
Now that I realize that.
Let me be honest with you. I think it is overwhelming. I get overwhelmed by that sometimes. I do. I wrote this book on productivity, and things have picked up. And sometimes I feel like I can spend all day just defining my work. And I'm trying to get that figured out. I think a key solution is teamwork. I think I work best in an organization where there's other people to delegate to. Right now, finally I'm building a team, but for the last couple of years I've been working mostly myself, and without people to delegate to, it was a lot harder. And defining your work is a distinct skill from doing your work. They're different skill sets, and some people might be really good at doing their work and not so good at defining their work. And that's where the interaction of vocations and different giftings come into play, and why there is value in managers. Some people talk down about managers. They say, if you want your company to be productive, get rid of managers. And there's a certain type of manager which gets in the way. They're always about saying no. No. But the notion that every manager intrinsically is scared and helpless and the world is too fast for him and we need to get rid of managers and only have leaders is wrong. There's a distinction between leadership and management. Management is about bringing order to complexity, and there's a place for that in our work in organizations. That's part of the task of defining work. So I think in part it points to the value of good management, actually. And it's neat. I think I took it out of the book. Maybe it's in there. No, but I argue that caring about the Great Commission implies caring about good management and administration, because those things are necessary for getting the work done. In fact, here at Southern, in I think Dan Dumas's office, there's a painting and it says something like logistics matter, or logistics are the heart of the war, or something. It's a painting from World War II or something, and logistics matter. The thing is, everyone has different interests. Like I know some pastors, they really talk down about logistics sometimes, and it can be, you can think it's unspiritual because they're, one time I was in a meeting at a ministry talking about organizational health and how to have good meetings, and one guy said, "This is so boring to me. I just want to get out and prepare my message." And that was not fun to hear. Like, it shows a different gift set, but what it also shows is it sends a message that this isn't that important, but it is very important. But one last thing on this, and this is not involved in your question, but I did have to cut it out of the book, and I love it, and I want to put it in a future book, maybe on missions. So we got to distinguish three roles. There's the individual contributor, producer, there's the manager, and there's the leader. And management is about creating order out of chaos. Leadership is about creating change. So a lot of times the leaders aren't necessarily going to be super organized, because you can't organize change very well. Change has a self-organization to it, a spontaneity to it, kind of like the free market. So a leader has to allow more freedom and allow some chaos to happen as he or she is creating the change. But here's what's really cool. John Cotter, no relation, I'm sure. You're kidding me. Okay, well, I love his stuff on leadership. Oh, wow. That is really cool. Cotter writes some of the best stuff on leadership. And one of the things he says is a peacetime army can survive with good management up and down the ranks, but good leaders only at the top. But a wartime army cannot. No one has ever figured out how to manage soldiers into battle. They must be led. And I thought, that's awesome. And it relates to us as Christians, because when I read that, I thought about the Great Commission. He's not talking about the Great Commission. He's talking about literal warfare. And now think about that. If we had to go out there and fight, and I'm here only talking about organization and nothing motivational, nothing inspiring people to take action, it's going to be hard to go out there and fight. You can't manage people into battle. You have to lead them into battle. That's what he had a great article, I think the late 70s, arguing that most of the business world had forgotten the realm of inspiration and passion and focus just on order, and he helped really change things by talking about the necessity of leadership. And I think as Christians, we need to learn that lesson from John Cotter and apply it to the Great Commission. I think the only way for us to get the Great Commission done, and by the way, I just want to say, why isn't it done yet, is not only to learn more about management and administration, but to learn about leadership and apply leadership to the task of completing the Great Commission. So I think there is a huge place for Christians. We can end on this. We talked mostly on how in the business world, learning about productivity can help you change the world. So also in the task of ministry, missionaries and ministry leaders, if we really want to make a dent in the Great Commission, we need to learn about productivity, personal productivity. We need to learn better about management, and we need to learn better about leadership so we can apply those disciplines to the task at hand. So, yeah. All right.